In this video, we're going to cover Chapter 1, which is all about the background and rationale behind studying, learning, and behavior. So our plan for today is to talk about a little bit of important history and especially how this field has developed in terms of studying behavior in humans. We're going to talk about learning in general, some of the basic methods we can use to study learning, and then we can also talk about why we use non-human animals as research models. So each of those will get covered throughout this lecture. Now, at this point in your university careers, most, if not all, of the names that we're going to discuss in this history section are probably going to be very familiar to you. And some of them we're going to cover multiple times because what they did was relevant to what comes up in later chapters. So we're going to go over this fairly quickly. But our first figure is René Descartes. And before Descartes, the general consensus was that human behavior was determined and controlled by free will. Basically, that everything that we did was voluntary and that we had conscious intent for all of our behaviors and actions. However, when Descartes came around, he decided to say that there were some automatic responses to certain stimuli, so we could have involuntary responses. Now, that isn't to say that he thought that everything was automatic. What we instead ended up with was something called Cartesian dualism, where we have a combination of voluntary and involuntary behaviors. So he didn't completely abandon free will. It's a combination of both. Now here we can point out that he thought that non-human animals were separate and distinct from humans, and therefore animals would lack free will and the voluntary behavior associated with it. The rationale there being that animals would lack a mind or a soul, and therefore wouldn't be capable of that voluntary behavior. So in his view, other animals would only have that involuntary or reflexive kind of behavior. So if we want to look at a diagram showing the difference between voluntary and involuntary types of behaviors, we have one up here on the screen. So our voluntary actions are things that derive from the mind. So if we look at only the blue part of this diagram here, the voluntary control part of the mind is here. We have the pineal gland being involved as sort of a means of converting orders from the mind into something physical that our body would be doing. So this was his way of trying to explain how something non-physical and even spiritual, like the mind, could actually physically interact with the body. In fact, the pineal gland is actually just an endocrine gland that produces melanin when it's dark out so that we go to sleep. So it's not anything mystical and magical, but at the time, that's kind of how he viewed it. But yeah, so that would connect our mind and our sort of spirit to our bodies where we wanted to decide to do something, and then the brain would send that command to the muscles and produce a voluntary response. So that's for our voluntary behaviors. That's for the things that we are choosing to do and are conscious of. Those originate at the mind. Our involuntary behaviors would be called reflexes, things that happen automatically, and they would originate in the physical world. So the trigger for a reflexive behavior would actually be some kind of stimulus in the environment. And stimulus just being the singular for stimuli, where you have multiple things that could trigger that. So a stimulus could be something like you see a predator in the environment, or you touch something hot, or whatever, any kind of stimulus that your body could react to. And so the pathway here is shown in red, where we have some kind of physical stimulus, which we perceive with our sense organs, whether it be our eyes, our ears, our sense of touch, whatever. That sense gets traveled along our nerves to the brain, and then we have this sort of automatic response back to our muscles to produce an involuntary response. So that involuntary pathway is much shorter. It just goes up to the brain and back again, where and sort of it bounces in and out, whereas our voluntary behaviors, the blue stuff, starts in the mind and is sort of a one-way direction out. And I suppose I should state here that from his view of sort of non-human animals, where he assumed that they had no ability for voluntary behavior, that pathway would be absent in other animals. So only humans would have this part of the pathway, specifically the mind to pineal gland to brain part of it. They would rely entirely on this involuntary arc here. And as far-fetched as the part about the pineal gland and the animal spirits connecting our spirit to our body and causing actions, as far-fetched as that was, some of Descartes' ideas were actually kind of correct. Not entirely, though, obviously. So the idea of there being an automatic response to some environmental stimuli, yeah, we do see evidence for that. And down here at the bottom, I've actually shown what we might see in a reflex arc, where we have some kind of stimulus coming in through our receptors, our sensory neurons, takes it into our spinal cord, where our interneurons allow us to bridge the gap to our motor neurons, where we have some kind of response. So in a reflex arc, that can happen without brain involvement. So it is possible to have an automatic or reflexive response that's completely involuntary. However, with Descartes' ideas, he actually only thought that there was one set of nerves, that the sort of incoming and outgoing signals were traveling along the same nerves. But as we see in this diagram here, we have sensory neurons that are our input and motor neurons that are our output. So we don't have one set of nerves. We'd have two or even three if we count the interneurons. Descartes thought about nerves as being hollow tubes, and animal spirits were what were causing the transference of signals. Nowadays, we know that our nerves are cells, and we can travel that signal along because of action potentials, which I forgot the name of there for a moment. But yeah, definitely not animal spirits in this case. And Descartes thought that reflexes are all innate and fixed, so they can't be learned, they just exist from birth and can never change. But we wouldn't have much of a course here if we couldn't talk about things that we learn. So all reflexes are not going to be innate. And in a couple of, actually, probably next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about things like habituation, where we can see that there are sort of some reflexes that happen automatically, but they can change over time just due to exposure. So yes, no to all of these. So Descartes got one thing kind of right, and the rest, we got there eventually. So our summary of Descartes is that he described how reflexes are related to behavior. That sort of automatically occurring thing happens, and gave us a good idea for that pathway. Also described a neural circuit that included the brain. This, at the time, wasn't a really common idea that our behaviors would involve the brain. So having that point was a good idea and got us heading in the right direction. Descartes also made a distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior. And his idea of dualism showed us that our voluntary behaviors and our involuntary behaviors have very different sources and slightly different pathways. Descartes described how our physical world could influence the brain and therefore our behavior, either in a voluntary or involuntary way. And all of his ideas, all these new ways of thinking, led to two different schools of thought. Started off with mentalism and reflexology. So mentalism is focusing on the contents and workings of the mind. So people who wanted to look at that voluntary behavior, stuff that originated in the mind and gave us conscious and intentional behavior. And then reflexology would focus in on the mechanisms of reflexive or involuntary behavior. And these two traditions studying either the mind or our reflexive behaviors kind of carried through to later research and later learning. The next concept we want to talk about is nativism. And this is a philosophy that we as humans are born with innate or inborn ideas. So as soon as we are born, we have this sort of set of thoughts and ideas that come already pre-programmed, and all humans have the same existing set of ideas. And so a lot of people would attach this to some concept of God or a concept of self and some kind of fundamental axioms of geometry, basically how we view our world. Now, Descartes actually believed in nativism, but with some caveats. He wasn't an exclusive believer in nativism, so he didn't think that everything that we know only came from what we were born with. He also believed that some of the contents in our mind would come from sensory experience. Specifically, his idea of the pineal gland connecting our body and mind allowed us to learn things from our environment and kind of change what our mind knew. And so obviously, as scientists, this inborn idea doesn't really fly because we see a lot of people with different ideas, and ideas change because, hey, we're here to study learning. So nativism can't be the whole story. And that's kind of what the empiricists thought in contrast. So nativism was very common and very popular among those who could be considered scientists at the time. But others came up and, in contrast, started empiricism. So it's a direct reaction to nativism. And you'll find that a lot of these schools come up in complete opposite positions to one another. But empiricism is a philosophy that all ideas in the mind come from experience. So the complete opposite of nativism. So nativism is we're born with all of our ideas pre-programmed, and empiricism is we start with no ideas and we build them up from experiences with our environment. So everything comes from experience. And when we talk about empiricism, we mostly talk about the British empiricists. So Locke and Hobbes are our two major figures here. So John Locke, he's the one who had the idea of a tabula rasa, the idea that we're born as a clean slate. So a stark contrast to nativism, he believed that we were born with absolutely no ideas in our head, and absolutely everything was acquired through experience. Thomas Hobbes was actually an interesting case here. So he agreed with Descartes that there should be sort of voluntary and involuntary behaviors. There were two sort of distinct categories. However, Descartes believed that our mind wasn't really predictable and orderly. So if we thought that we were going to do something, we would just do it, and there wasn't any rhyme or reason to what we thought and what we decided to do. However, Hobbes thought that even our voluntary behavior would be predictable and lawful, so that it should have that same structure like what we would see in a reflex, just with the involvement of the mind. Now, what governed our mind and what sort of controlled our voluntary behavior? According to Hobbes, our voluntary behavior is controlled by the idea of hedonism, or hedonism, I suppose is the correct way to say that. And this is the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So everything that you do is to feel good as much as possible and to avoid feeling bad as much as possible. And that pursuit is what would control our voluntary behavior. He didn't really care if this was a desirable or a justified view of the world, if it was the right thing to do. He just thought that that's how we naturally existed. One of the most important factors of empiricism, and specifically our British empiricists, is the idea of associations. And this is that linking of different concepts together. So British empiricists thought that simple associations could combine into more complex ideas, and that everything that we learned came from making associations. So we'd start by making very simple associations early on, and as time goes on, we make associations between associations between associations to build up very complex ideas. And that's how we would learn about our environment. And so an example of this, an association, would be something like associating a word with the object that that word is about. So the word car makes you think of cars. That's an association. The letters C-A-R don't necessarily link directly to an actual vehicle, but because of learning, because of experience, we've formed an association between those particular letters in that particular order, or said aloud in a particular way, that they mean that object. So we've formed an association. And again, you can build up on those associations, link them together. So our simple associations could be considered building blocks of our mental activity. They're the sort of little pieces that come together to build all of our mental activities. Now we can talk about both the primary laws and secondary laws of association. Our primary laws of association are actually borrowed from Aristotle, so these came from much, much longer ago, but they seem to fit with the British empiricists' ideas of association, and so they adopted them. So we can look at contiguity, similarity, and contrast, and these are basically determining how we form associations or links between different things. So contiguity basically tells us that if things occur close to each other in time and space, so if you see an apple and you see it sitting underneath a tree, you might make the association that that apple probably came from that tree, so it's probably an apple tree. They have close contiguity, so we link them and associate them together. For similarity, two things that share some feature, those might be linked together. So you see things with wings and categorize them as birds. You have associated them based on the similarity of having wings. We also have an interesting idea of contrast, where they thought that you could associate things that were sort of complete opposites. This one's a little bit harder of a logical stretch to get. We have no modern evidence that we do form associations between things that are in stark contrast, but it was one of their primary laws of association, so we do mention it here. For our secondary laws of association, these aren't so much presented as sort of ways that we immediately link things together based on how they relate to one another. This is more about forming associations and sort of how is the pairing done. So this is going to be a lot closer to what we talk about all throughout this course in terms of, say, classical conditioning. So our pairing of our stimuli, how does that affect the association that we learn? So intensity, frequency, recency, and other associations can affect how we can pair two stimuli together. So intensity, if the stimuli are really, really intense, really, really strong, then they might form a stronger association. Frequency, if you see them more often together, then you might associate them together more strongly. You might remember that it's a lot easier to pair two stimuli or associate two ideas if they are presented close together. If there's a long delay between something happening and some other thing happening, you tend not to associate them. And our existing associations shape how we perceive things. So if we've already learned to associate a particular stimulus with, we associate balloons with parties, then maybe it's going to be a lot easier to associate balloons with other happy things. So our pre-existing associations help us shape ideas and can make it easier for us to acquire new associations. This is very, very brief because talking about this stuff at length is basically the point of this course. So we'll get into this a lot more as the time goes on. But down at the bottom here, I have sort of one important thing to note. And this is that these philosophers, our British empiricists, didn't actually perform any kind of experiments to validate their rules of association. Their version of science at the time consisted of sitting around and sort of talking logically about these ideas. but they never actually did any real scientific experiments. So they don't have any evidence to support these ideas. At the time, they just thought that it made sense and therefore it must be true. So as time has gone on and we've been able to look into and experiment with these ideas, we're a lot more confident in their existence and how they work. But when they were first proposed, none of that was there. Now, as I said, people could then go back and start testing these associations, these rules of associations, to see if there was any validity to them, see if they could find any evidence to support them. So the first person that we're going to talk about who actually went back and started testing these rules was Ebbinghaus. And so Ebbinghaus is famous for his, basically his forgetting curves. But if you don't know who he is, he was a researcher. He used nonsense syllables, basically two consonants separated by a vowel. These were meant to be stand-ins for words. So consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant. He would remove any that were actual words, so he wouldn't use something like boy because that already had a prior association. So these nonsense syllables, assumedly, wouldn't have any previous associations, so he was trying to look at neutral equivalents to words. And as part of his experiments, he would memorize lists, hundreds and hundreds of these nonsense syllables, and then test his ability to recall those lists under different conditions. So he would use different levels of training. So did he read the list over once? Did he read it over 10 times? Did he read it 100 times? And closeness in list, did he remember words, or I guess nonsense syllables, that were in close proximity to one another in the list or not? If he was given this word, could he remember the one that came next? Could he remember the one that came before? All sorts of different tests of his memory. And he, as I said, came up with a forgetting curve, but also a learning curve, and he looked at spacing effects and so on. So grab a pen here. So you might remember them looking like this, where we'd have a strong curve, our forgetting curve, where we would ask sort of the number of words that you could remember over time. Or we could look at, so if there was a delay in your recall, so if you read a list and then were immediately asked how many words you remembered, you'd remember more. And then as there was more and more of a delay, you'd forget more of them. Also, how many times would you have to go over it to learn it, that sort of thing. So he looked at everything he could think of in terms of putting together lists and how we could remember and forget those lists. The one thing to keep in mind here with Ebbinghaus is, yes, this was sort of the first and closest approach to a scientific method of testing. However, Ebbinghaus only worked with himself. He was his own test subject. So take his work with a grain of salt because he was only working on his own mind. So he is an N of 1. Okay, but that's enough with associations. Let's go back to reflexes for a little bit. So Descartes, his basic theory of a reflex arc was correct, where the stimulus in the environment is going to be triggering a response. His mechanisms, not so much. So how did they figure out what was going on? How do we figure out how reflexes were actually working? So to better understand this physiological process responsible for reflex behavior, we're going to look at Sechenov and Pavlov, basically the two Ivans, because apparently all of the Russians doing this kind of work at this time happened to both be named Ivan. So it's nice and easy, I suppose. So let's start with Sechenov. Now, before Sechenov, there was this idea that input is equal to output. So if you have some kind of stimulus in your environment, if it's a big and intense stimulus, there should be some kind of big and intense behavioral response. However, Sechenov was finding that input doesn't equal output, and a lot of his theories focused on the idea that there isn't a direct connection between intensity of input and output. So the implication here is that the response strength, so the response of our behavior, is independent of the stimulus strength or stimulus intensity. Oh, we can see this really easily with something like a sneeze. A small piece of dust can cause a very large sneeze, so a small stimulus with a large output. So stimuli are more releasers, small little triggers that can cause an event that doesn't necessarily have to be small. So our voluntary thoughts and behaviors could be elicited by inconspicuous or even faint stimuli. The intensity doesn't really matter. And he talked about an extended use of that reflex mechanism to try and explain lots and lots of different behaviors. So basically, he came up with some sort of logical arguments where we could see reflexes in places other than the standard examples that you're probably used to seeing in textbooks by now. So he wasn't just looking at our automatic withdrawal response when we touch something hot, but he'd try and find how reflexes might be involved in things like social interactions or something like that. The issue with Sechenov is that he failed to address how experience can alter behavior. So there wasn't any room for changes or learning, which is what we're really interested in. And also, there wasn't a whole lot of empirical testing here. There wasn't a lot of scientific experimentation to give evidence to any of his ideas. So another thing to just keep in mind. Now, our second Ivan is Ivan Pavlov, and this is one that you should be much more familiar with and probably quite an expert on at this point. Pavlov is really, really important because he conducted empirical studies, lots of them, extensively. And so his research gave us a lot more evidence and gave us a lot more certainty on what was going on, especially in terms of reflexes and specifically associations between a stimulus and some kind of response. So sometimes you're going to see it, actually a lot of times in this class, you're going to see this SR unit, S being stimulus, R being response. And so an SR unit would be looking at the association between a particular stimulus and a particular behavioral response. And Pavlov told us that new reflexes can be learned through association. Basically, classical or Pavlovian conditioning. You can learn new reflexes, new behaviors would happen in response to different stimuli because of associations that we've learned. So things are not innate, things are not inflexible, things can change as we learn. Now, Pavlov's ideas and concepts and experiments are essential for the field of functional neurology. So nervism is basically the idea that all of our behaviors and behavioral processes are regulated by the nervous system. And that idea at the time wasn't very common, but it's become a lot more accepted nowadays, where we do know that our nerves are involved in pretty much every aspect of behavior. So Pavlov's research was originally intended to study digestion in dogs, but by happenstance he noticed some odd behaviors and associations, and he adjusted his field of study to also include reflexes in dogs, and that's how we ended up with Pavlovian conditioning. Now, this is a very, very Coles Notes version of this because we're going to talk about Pavlov and classical conditioning ad nauseum, especially in Chapter 3, so we'll save some of that for later. So that's enough about history. Let's move on to some of the terms and ideas and concepts that are really going to help shape what we're doing for the rest of the semester. The first and most basic of these in a Principles of Learning class is, what is learning? So learning is acquiring new information in some way. We can learn to make a response. An example in nature could be a parasite learning to land on a good host versus a non-good host. For humans, we could look at maybe you learn to hold the door open for your mother when her hands are full of groceries because it makes her happy. Learning is also learning not to make a response or withholding a response. So a natural thing being not leaving the safety of your nest because it could be dangerous to leave. Or for humans, Maybe not asking your boss for a raise when he's mad, because then he's not likely to give you a raise. The really cool part about learning, at least to me, is that we don't really need special instruction to learn these kinds of responses or non-responses. We don't need to have instructions on how to behave appropriately. We can actually just observe things in our environment and kind of make conclusions based on experience, but we don't need an explicit lesson on how to do them. So you learn as a child that when you get into an elevator, you stand facing the door because people look at you weird if you stand the wrong way around. So you adjust your behavior without needing to be told explicitly that you need to adjust your behavior. A lot of the experiments we're going to talk about in this class are going to focus on conditioning or training, something where there's sort of that intentionality there, where you're trying to get them to learn a particular thing. But we should keep in mind that there's a lot of maybe passive learning that happens as well, where it isn't as explicitly stated. So even though there is that passive side of things, we are mainly going to focus on learning through analyzing behavior and behavior models. And a lot of these are going to have sort of more intentional or more laid out goals, but it's good to know that there are both there. But our behavioral studies of learning are really going to give us clues to the machinery of our nervous system, sort of what's going on under the surface. So in previous classes on learning, you might have already gone over some of the sort of surface stuff, the learning of associations and giving a response versus withholding a response. But now we're going to get into sort of what's driving all of that. What's driving the learning process? What's driving the behavior? A little bit more in depth. So I guess our next logical progression from learning in a Principles of Learning class is to talk about what behavior is. So a really great quote from Skinner is that behavior is anything a person or other animal does that can be measured. So a behavior could be an action. It also could be an absence of action. It could be some kind of physiological reaction, things like heart rate or perspiration. There's sort of a question mark here because maybe thoughts and feelings might be linked to behavior, but that's kind of up for debate. It's going to depend on who you ask and what their perspective is on behavior, but most people will agree that actions, absence of actions, and physiological reactions are all definitely types of behavior, mostly because they can be observed and measured. And so I'm going to come back very briefly to what is learning from more of a scientific side now, because we want to give it basically a definition that we can work with. And so the first of these comes from the text. Learning is an enduring change in the mechanisms of behavior involving specific stimuli and or responses that result from prior experience with those or similar stimuli and responses. So the parts that I care most about here are the fact that it's an enduring change. It's something that's going to last for a fairly long time. It's going to involve some kind of stimulus that's triggering that response, and then also the responses that happen. And our prior experience is what creates that link or association between stimuli and responses. So those are the important parts of that definition. We could simplify it and look at learning as a change in behavior due to changes in the environment. Our environment being where a particular stimulus would be coming from. Now, performance is a term that's going to be pretty closely related to learning. Performance is an organism's activities at a particular time. So we can see a change in performance as a response to learning. So an organism can adjust their activities, adjust their behavior because of learning, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes a change in performance can come from things other than learning. A really simple example of this is maybe the animal is tired. If you're getting an animal to push a button or something, and over time they push the button less, maybe they've learned not to push the button, or maybe they're tired and just disinterested in the button. So performance changes aren't always due to learning, even though we do say that learning is a change in behavior. So learning changes behavior, but not all changes in behavior come from learning. That's sort of the logical way to state it. So we have to get a little bit more evidence, a little bit more certainty that that change is being caused by what they've learned. And I guess we should talk about what isn't learning. So, like I said, there are other things that can be responsible for a change in behavior. So changes in bodily state, if you're hungry, if you're tired, if you're thirsty, if your hormones adjust, that can all be because of, or that can all cause changes in behavior that aren't associated with learning. Can also see a change in our environment. Maybe the ambient temperature has changed, or maybe the light levels have changed. And that can change our behavior, and it isn't necessarily linked to learning. We also see sort of more long-term things like maturation. So as individuals grow and mature, they might get bigger or taller, and something about how they've grown and changed can adjust their behavior. So if a child is getting older, maybe they don't have to go get a chair to reach a cabinet in their house. That isn't necessarily that they've learned to get it without a chair. It's that they're now tall enough to get into that cabinet without a chair. So we want to have this distinction between performance and learning. So we can see differences in performance for other reasons. Learning is one of the reasons we can see a change in performance, but it isn't the only reason. And I guess our next question might be, why do we learn? There's adaptive significance to learning. So there's some kind of benefit in terms of fitness when we learn. So we do things that are related to our survival, things like finding food or shelter, finding a mate, interacting with others. All of those can help us survive. Now, a lot of these terms and ideas are very closely related to things like natural selection and evolution, but you don't necessarily evolve a particular ability. Maybe if finding food is becoming more difficult, over time you might evolve to have a slower or more efficient metabolism, so you don't need as much food, but that can take a really long time. Those environmental changes can outpace evolution. And in these cases, organisms that learn can have a leg up on organisms that can't learn. So instead of waiting for some kind of physical evolution of the body, maybe organisms learn to eat a different food source or to work together to get to previously unreachable food sources. So organisms that have this ability to learn and adapt their behavior can outlive those that do not. And in those cases, that ability to learn increases their fitness, specifically their reproductive fitness. So we can talk about indirect benefits, where if you are living longer because you're surviving longer because of what you've learned, you tend to produce more offspring because you're around longer to breed more. A more direct effect of this increase to reproductive fitness could be that maybe you've learned in such a way that allows you to fertilize more eggs and produce more offspring directly. So maybe you've learned something that makes you a more appealing mate, and you then directly have more offspring. So a couple of different ways that learning can increase our reproductive fitness, and therefore there's an adaptive significance to learning. We can evolve an ability to learn, which is really, really cool. So if learning is so cool, how do we actually study learning? Most of what we're going to talk about in this course is going to come back to experimentation. And almost always we're going to talk about experimentation in the lab. Labs are beneficial in that they give us a much more controlled environment, so we can be a lot more certain of the causal relationship between the thing that we're manipulating and the changes in behavior that we're observing. You can conduct experiments in nature, but there are more variables to consider, and there's a lot more potential for extraneous circumstances to influence your information. So lab experiments are preferred, but they're not the only way to do it. So the first step in our setting up of a study would usually be to try and identify the stimuli in the environment that might be responsible for causing those long-term changes in behavior. Basically, identify things that we think might be causing the learning. Then we can set up different types of training or different kinds of treatment between groups of individuals. So we might have a control group that receives no new training, and we might have an experimental group that receives a particular kind of exposure that we think is going to cause them to learn something. Then we can sort of control which one is exposed to what in that laboratory environment, and we can measure the output behavior. And so ideally, our control group would show some kind of flat line or unchanging behavior, and our experimental group would show some kind of difference in behavior, either more or less of the behavior that we're looking at. So we want to compare between those two groups. Now, this isn't always possible. Sometimes you don't have the ability to have two distinct groups, or maybe sometimes you're restricted on what you can and can't expose individuals to. But you can also see situations where you would have sort of a baseline beforehand, and then you would do your training here and then see changed behavior and have the assumption that the behavior wouldn't have changed without the training, but these kinds of setups are a lot less statistically sound, I guess we could say. It's a lot harder to show a causal relationship with only a baseline and then a testing. We'd have to have a little bit more to it there, but we can talk about more of that as it becomes relevant in the course. And then one of the important things with all of this is that we're trying to rule out mechanisms that aren't learning. So you want to try and watch for things like motivation or environmental changes or all that stuff we talked about that can affect behavior, because you want to be sure that your treatment and your treatment alone is responsible for the difference between our control group and our experimental group. That's basic scientific method, but that's kind of what it's going to look like for most of the course. And so how do we tell if learning has actually occurred? Well, we can observe the behavior. Has it changed between those two groups? Or did it change from before to after the training was implemented? And then we can kind of look at other sources of causation. So our training was one factor that changed between the before and the after, or between group A and group B. Was there anything else that differed between those groups or between those periods in time? So we can look for other possible sources and maybe try and rule those out as potential causes. So just a very quick summary of what we just did. All right, and then this brings us to the next section where we want to start talking about the link between humans and non-human animals and why so much of the research that we're going to talk about is going to look at non-human animal models. So a lot of people who are in psychology are interested in how people think, how people learn, how people behave. But it's not always viable to study humans. Sometimes we want to look at something that's a little bit easier to study, and that's where our non-human animal models come in. And so for our sort of justification for why a non-human animal might be a reasonable model, we can look at things that we have that are similar. So humans and non-human animals both find food, search for shelter, provide for their young, have methods of protecting themselves, find mates. The methods for going about this are all going to be very different, but even between animal species, between frogs and raccoons, you're going to find shelter in different ways. You're going to find food in different ways. So the degree of difference between non-human animal species isn't any more different than humans and animals necessarily. So we're not necessarily saying that they're identical, we're just saying that they're similar, and maybe they're similar enough that using them as a model might be helpful. So if we wanted to have a sort of general idea of how we approach animal models, this is a very simplified version of that. So the general processes approach is basically going to focus on looking for commonalities between species. A lot of studies of learning focus on this idea of finding overlap, finding common behaviors, finding common actions and mechanisms, rather than focusing on the sort of disparity that can exist between species, because that can get easily overwhelming. So we're going to opt to assume that learning phenomena are products of elemental processes that operate pretty much in the same way across a bunch of different learning situations. So we're going to kind of make some assumptions that learning in pigeons might be similar to learning in rats, which is similar to learning in horses. So there might be some universal element that is sort of consistent between all of those. So we can formulate general rules that seem to exist across all animals, and we can test those generalities. And these are sort of quote-unquote universal elemental laws. The quotes are there because they're not always identical. We're just looking for close here. So, especially with laws of association, they tend to be fairly consistent across multiple species, and that gives us some idea that learning processes should be fairly similar between species. But we do have to keep in mind that there are lots and lots of differences, and they come from a lot of different areas. So, animals may learn about diverse stimuli. It's going to depend on what they're exposed to. So just like humans are sort of hardwired to respond really well to other human faces, animals may be kind of pre-programmed to respond to relevant stimuli. So things that they should watch out for, or things that draw their attention based on how they've evolved. And those sort of pre-programmed defaults will be different for different species based on what's relevant to them. We also learn to perform diverse responses. So the way that a raccoon handles their food is different from how a mouse handles their food, which is different from how a bird handles their food. So those responses are all very different, even though it's kind of performing the same task. And we're also going to have different learning rates and speeds just based on our capacity to learn. So there's lots of differences between species. But what we care about is that sort of the underlying structures are going to be fairly similar. Now, how do we get at these sort of universal elements if we have so many possible species to look at? One of the best approaches is to actually look at lots and lots of different species. Traditionally, lab animals that are used for studying learning tend to be things like pigeons, rats, and mice, things that are very easy to get your hands on, very easy to house in a lab, and that tend to function well in lab environments. But as time goes on, and as we start seeing more and more species and more new models being used, we're getting a better idea of which elements are actually universal and which ones are specific to particular species or groups. So instead of just our traditional lab rats, we would want to look at things like other vertebrates, start to look at fish, maybe cats, dogs, get into human research, sea lions, dolphins. We can even get into what other people might classify as more primitive species, things like fruit flies or other insects, mollusks, different like marine species that don't necessarily have a traditional brain layout like slugs. So the more diverse our research can be, the better idea we can have about some of these universal ideas. But I want to keep you aware of the fact that there isn't as much diversity in the literature, at least not quite yet. We're getting better, but it's there. All right, so I've talked about animals as models. What do I mean by that? So most of the time, people are looking for animals as a model of human behavior. Basically, it's very difficult to study particular things in humans. Humans are really tough subjects. We're intelligent in that we can choose to do things. We can think ahead of what's going on in an experiment and adjust our behaviors accordingly. We can cause problems with that. Our behavior is very reactive, so on and so forth. Humans aren't ideal subjects, and sometimes it's not physically possible to do a particular type of experiment in humans. So maybe we can find an animal model that could be a stand-in to give us a better idea of how a human might react to a particular setting. One major field where we see a lot of this is medical research. So in order for, say, a new drug to be approved, there has to be thorough testing in animal models to show that it's a viable process. So if we can find a species that reacts to this drug in a very similar way, or who has a very similar mechanism that we're trying to target, that's very similar to what humans have, we might do our trial period with that animal, and once we've shown that it is beneficial, we might move on to trials in humans. So sort of a proof of concept to get us forward and give health benefits to humans. Now, even though I myself am a cognitive psychologist by trade, I don't actually care too much about connecting animal behavior to human behavior. So the first point isn't really my thing. I'm a little bit closer to the second point here, where I see animal models as a model for general biological processes. I'd like to figure out how learning is occurring, and by looking at more species, I can see the similarities across multiple species. So you don't necessarily have to connect their behavior to humans, you can connect it to other species, and you can look at how that general biological process is similar or different across multiple different species. And here we're going to look a lot at associative learning in lots of different animal models, and we can connect it to humans or not depending on the particular situation. You can also use animal models as a model for conservation, and this is actually another one that I've had a little bit of experience with. But the more you understand an animal model and the better you know how they work and learn, the more you can use that knowledge to help, say, an endangered species. So you could have a captive breeding program. They had to do this with peregrine falcons. After, I think it was DDT, really severely impacted peregrine falcons and the population was almost extinct. They bred a bunch of them in captivity and re-released them. But you have to know about how peregrine falcons work and how they learn to be able to give them the right skills to release them so that they'd survive. So you can learn about these animals, learn about these models, and use what you learn to help them survive and thrive out in the wild. So not all animal models are directly linked to humans, though quite a few end up that way. So when we're using animals in research, the first question people tend to ask is why? Why do we choose to use animals? We've already covered some of those in that it's very difficult to use humans and sometimes non-human animals are better subjects, but better how? The first is that they're a lot easier to have in a controlled laboratory setting. So you can have a rat who sits in a maze so that we can study how they learn to navigate. It's really hard to do the same with humans. Animals have no language, so they don't have those pre-existing associations. A lot of studies with humans, if you give humans directions, the way that you give them directions, or the directions that you give, can then bias their behavior and change the outcoming. So no language is actually a benefit here. And we can also see a lack of what are called demand characteristics. So in humans, we often see that people will adjust their behavior to try and do what they think the experimenter wants. So we want to make them happy, so we're going to behave in the way that we think they want us to behave. And we may have good intentions for it, but it might be screwing with their data because we're not behaving naturally. We're not doing what we're actually doing. We're doing what we think that we should be doing. And animals don't do that, so we don't have to worry about demand characteristics. Now, this brings us to sort of the big question about research with animals, and that is it ethical to use animals? And I'm sure at this point you've covered ethics quite a bit, but because this course is so heavy with non-human animal research, I want to talk about ethics one more time, just so that you know that we are aware of the ethical restrictions and considerations that need to happen with animal research. So I guess the first point to make is there's the question of, is it ethical to use animals? Is it ethical for humans to be benefiting from the use of animals? And a lot of people would argue that in society, there's already a lot of ways that people benefit from animals, whether it be for garment making or food or labor. There's lots of ways that animals are already in use. Now, when it comes to animals in research, researchers have put in place lots and lots of rules and regulations and guidelines that ensure that animal research is done in the most ethical way possible. So if there is going to be a study that uses animals, we have to make sure that it is as minimally harmful, as minimally invasive as possible, and that it is maximally beneficial to society. So the first page here is our list of regulations, and I'm sure you know about these already, but there are regulations at absolutely every level of science. So we have institutional standards. So the University of Alberta has their own ethics committee that sits down and evaluates each experiment that's conducted at the university to determine if it is a valid study, if it's an ethical study, and if it's a necessary study. There are also federal standards, so standards that supersede our institutional standards. Basically, our institutional standards have to fit within the federal standards. Some institutions are even more strict than federal standards, but they tend to work fairly well hand in hand. And we also have standards at the level of the journals. So the whole point of doing research is to conduct your experiments, collect your data, and then publish your data in a journal so that others can see your work. In order to be published in any journal, you have to meet the ethical standards of that journal. And those ethical standards usually match with those of the country and of the institution that you're at. They all tend to work together. But in order to be a published author, you have to prove that you followed those ethical standards. And unethical work cannot be conducted and cannot be published. So basically, if you as a researcher don't follow ethics, you kind of end up blacklisted because journals won't take your work, institutions won't want to work with you, and you can end up being criminally charged. So it is a huge deal, and there are very specific rules on what you can and can't do. That is just a random floating slide that shouldn't be there, but when I'm talking about what you can and can't do, our general rule is to follow the 3 R's. So we replace, reduce, or refine. So the first of these is replace. You have an experiment that you want to conduct. You want to learn about a very particular thing. Does it have to use animals? Is there something else that you could use to conduct this study? An example of this is I've seen research done with what are called artificial neural networks. And in the lab that I've worked with, we've used these ANNs, artificial neural networks, to model the behavior of a bird making a decision. And so what we would do is set up an artificial neural network, give it the same acoustic stimuli that we would have given birds in operant boxes, and we ask that artificial neural network to categorize 2 different groups. Can you tell the difference between male vocalizations and female vocalizations? Can you tell the difference between vocalizations in the spring versus in the fall? Whatever that distinction would be. And you look at the output of that neural network, and it would tell you what features, what properties of the acoustic calls it was using to make that distinction, and that would give you an idea of what the birds might be using. You could then follow up with how birds do that themselves. So you can run an experiment to see what the birds respond to. Can they tell the difference between male and female calls? What features are they using? And if their performance matches what that neural network did, you can be more confident in the neural network's ability to make that distinction. And then maybe you don't have to run as many birds. Maybe you don't have to use birds in the future to do similar tasks. You've given a proof of concept and you've found an alternative. you can replace some, if not all, of the animals that you would have been using previously, which is really, really cool. Another way you can do it is to reduce. Can you use fewer animals? This is mostly a statistical question. So if you know approximately what kind of effect size you're looking for, what is the smallest number of animals that you can have in your experiment that would give you a reasonably good power to get good statistics? So you want to use the smallest number possible. In practice, it's really hard to get a feel for an effect size and calculate out the ideal number of animals. So in practice, what you usually see is that people will use a very small number of animals, and then they'll check their statistics for power. And if their power isn't high enough, they might then use a couple more animals and see what happens. So I've done operant conditioning with black-capped chickadees, and so what I'll do is I'll run, say, 10 birds. And for us, running a bird means you put the bird in an operant box and you let them hear different sounds and choose which sounds are good and which sounds are bad so that they learn the difference between the two. And then when the experiment is done, when we've collected our data, we bring them back to the colony room so that they can be there for the next experiment. So by starting with, say, just 10 birds, if my statistics look good and if I have reasonable power and a good effect size, I could call it there. But I might have to run additional animals to get the required power to look at what I'm looking for. So it's kind of a ideal situation versus in practice, but reduction is an important part. And the last point here is refinement. And this is, okay, we've decided that you have to run the experiment with those animals. You have to use the number that you have to use. Is there any way that you can refine or change your experiment to cause less harm? Can you use a less invasive technique? Can you make sure that there is some kind of mitigation of stress? Anything like that. What can you do to make this as unbad as possible? How can you make it as unharmful as possible? So that's our refine point there. And so at the end of here, I want to say that a lot of people who work with animals, we are aware of all of these procedures and guidelines and ethics and all of that, but also we tend to work with animals because we like animals. I have done research with birds, and I have birds for pets, and I love my birds, both in the lab and at home. So I'm doing everything I can to make sure that they are well cared for and not harmed in any way. And even for those who aren't, loving their species, they don't love their animals, unethical practices also produce bad research. Like I said, it can get you blacklisted to be unethical, but it also gives you poorer data and poorer results. So most animal research and pretty much all the research we're going to look at in this class are going to be very highly controlled and as ethical as possible based on all of these guidelines and for all of these reasons. So hopefully you can keep that in mind when we're talking about some of these experiments, that this is all of the vetting that they've had to go through to be produced.